All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another Adjunct Teachers in Animal Law webinar. My name is Rachel Pepper. I'm a 3L at GW Law, and I will be your moderator today. So, before we get into panelist introductions, I would just like to give a brief overview of this webinar series. The Animal Law program at GW Law School has established the Animal Legal Education Initiative, which strives to incorporate animal law as a standalone discipline within the legal academy. This webinar series is intended to support those efforts by creating opportunities for adjunct professors across the country to connect and collaborate with one another. And we also hope to provide you all with academic resources and a support system that can help you accomplish your goals within your institutions. So these webinars are truly intended to be conversational in a place in which we can all network. So to that end, please feel free to send questions and comments in the chat or unmute yourself at any point if you have a question. I might not be looking at the chat at all times, so please do feel free to unmute yourselves if you have anything to ask or anything to add. And I will also reserve some time at the end for questions. And we thank everyone who's able to for turning on your videos because it's always great to be able to put names to faces. And I do want to mention that if you missed our previous webinars, the recordings of those are up on the GW Law website, so please do feel free to check those out. Today's event is also being recorded and will be made available on the website as well, so if you'd like to reference back to today's discussion, it'll be there for you to do so. And please also feel free to share it with anyone who you think might also be interested in watching it. So just a few housekeeping matters before we get to introductions. Please do stay muted unless you are asking a question. Time will be left over at the end for Q&A. As I mentioned, that'll be about 5 to 10 minutes. So this particular webinar is going to be about in-class exercises in animal law courses. So I'll go ahead and let the panelists introduce themselves. Nancy, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I'm so happy to be here. It is really a joy for me to have the opportunity to be involved in academic work that helps me sort of zoom out of my daily work experience where I am at the ASPCA running the government relations program and, knee deep and sort of juggling between sometimes a legislative drafting question that comes up or prepping for a hearing, or thinking through a strategy for a bill, or working with our communications team on how we're going to speak to that legislation. That's kind of the day-to-day nitty-gritty. But being able to work with students, seeing their fresh approach to the issues that we work on is so enriching for me. And so I've been fortunate to be part of the adjunct pool for GW Law School for a couple decades now. And so I'm just delighted to be here.
Thank you. And Ralph, you're next on my screen if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Ralph Henry. I'm the Director of Litigation for Humane World for Animals, formerly known as Humane Society of the United States. And I have been an adjunct in animal law since 2009 and presently teach an experiential law course in animal law at Georgetown University Law Center. And I'll echo some of what Nancy said. I really appreciate teaching for the opportunity to sort of step back and think about animal law in a different way than I do in my practice, and to engage people who are interested in animal law that I wouldn't otherwise get to interact with through my practice.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Conley.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everybody. I'm Conley Wouters. I'm an assistant professor of law at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I teach animal law. I also teach a couple first-year courses, contracts, and legal writing. I'm pretty new to animal law. This will only be, when I teach in the spring, will only be the second time that I've taught it. I only became really invested in this field a few years ago. So it's been like a pretty rapid trajectory for me in a lot of really good ways. And so in addition to, completely echo what Nancy and Ralph said, I love teaching. I think it's very rewarding. It's also very challenging, like anything that's rewarding. But I'm really grateful to be part of this group. And in particular, I think trying to get not just more students involved in animal law and trying to figure out the best ways to reach those students like we do with these webinars, but also trying to get new educators because we could use as many as we can get, right? And there's a lot of really good lawyers and teachers out there. So yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. And now we can go ahead and get started. Before we fully jump in, we should establish what we're talking about when we say in-class exercises. So for the purposes of this panel, we'll use that term broadly to include anything requiring all students to respond to a prompt, but not including a quiz or a test. So first we'll start out by talking about some of the purposes and uses of in-class exercises. So what are some of the learning objectives that can be achieved by the use of in-class exercises in animal law courses?
I can start if you want. Learning to advocate for a position is an incredibly important skill for any attorney in any field of law. And that's something that these exercises can hone in on and can really provide students with an opportunity to practice and skill build. Verbal skill building is essential, and research skill building can be part of the exercises, and that's really essential. I think critical thinking in general can be honed by using exercises that allow you to be a little more in the moment, possibly working from a more impromptu space, having to generate background ideas and bring them forward and think about how to communicate them. And then audience adaptation. You're only as good a communicator as your ability to reach that particular audience. So I think being able to size up who you're talking to and figure out how best to articulate something is really important. So my exercises have usually focused around those skill building areas.
Yeah, I can just building on that. I completely agree with what Nancy said. I think that's really well put. And as a person who teaches first year legal writing, I think a lot about legal skills, right? Teaching legal skills. And I really try to make like everything in that class, in my first year class, an opportunity to engage students in some sort of like, in addition to whatever analytical skills they're learning, an opportunity to think about what's the practical aspect of this, what is the advocacy point, like the takeaway point, right? I think that's not only just as important in animal law classes, and exercises are the best way to do this in animal law classes, but it's also like we have a lot of space to do what we want in there, right? Like we can like experiment, and like usually at least we have a lot of control over the course design because there often isn't a course when you're teaching it, or maybe there's been one on and off, which was the case for me. So I think it's not just, that there are all these opportunities in the way that Nancy's talking about, but I sort of feel like we have an obligation to take advantage of this, this position that we're in the animal law classroom. And I realize I'm sort of painting with a broad brush here. It may not always be the case depending on the particular course offering. But if we have that kind of discretion in terms of design, I think it's really beneficial to students to take the extra effort, because it is more work, and think about, okay, how can we best learn whatever we're learning while also developing some sort of skill that an animal lawyer would use in their day-to-day work.
Yeah, those are great responses. I'll just add that from my perspective, I get a lot of students in my animal law courses who are not ultimately going to end up practicing animal law. Some of them will, but a great many of them will practice in the public interest in some way. So I also try to give some thought to learning objectives associated with public interest practice, even beyond animal law. Things like why legal campaigns, not just project by project lawyering, but legal campaigns succeed or fail, or speaking to different audiences, thinking about long-term goals relevant to short-term projects. So I'm sure we'll get into some examples of exercises, but my exercises, to the extent I've used them, have sort of tied into some of those types of learning objectives, what it's like to be and think like a public interest lawyer.
Absolutely. Thank you all. And similarly, the animal law class I'm in right now, Crimes Against Animals, is giving us opportunities to do exercises like voir dire and witness examination, which are infused with animal law because that's our fact pattern, but they're also applicable to any number of legal professions. So I definitely agree. It's a really great opportunity to teach students some of those practical skills. So, what other factors, if any, influence your decision on whether to use in-class exercises?
I mean, I can start and just say that when I was sort of jotting down some notes in preparation for this discussion, I realized that I don't think there was a single class period when I taught animal law where I didn't do something that would qualify as an in-class exercise, right? The way that we're defining it in the prompt. And that's because I teach contracts in some semesters I teach it all in 3 hours, like at night, right? And there's just a lot of material to get through, and sometimes I have to just do the Socratic method and the lecture thing. There's no other way to do it. But if I don't have to do that in animal law, I usually end up doing something. So for me, it's not like so much a consideration, I guess, of if I'm going to use them. It's just time budgeting, which I know we'll talk about later. Sort of like how much am I going to talk or how much are we going to do, just kind of a discussion versus some sort of group work, individual work, some other kind of exercise. And that often depends on like where we're at in the semester, right? How things have been going, what has worked or hasn't worked, and also just trying to ensure that there is some variety in the 2 hours that we meet. So I think that helps engage students. So mine, I would say, is somewhat improvisational.
I really appreciate that answer, Conley, because I'm someone who I think, like many adjuncts who start teaching, started gravitating immediately to lecture or Socratic method sort of format of teaching, and you maybe lose a lot if you just stick with that. And so a factor that I keep in mind is that different students have different learning styles. And so whether you have a seminar that's kind of more of a freewheeling discussion, or you just engage in kind of a lecture format, some students will learn better or differently when they're asked to apply concepts, or to work with others to find solutions, potential solutions to problems or prompts. And so that's one other factor I've thought about that's caused me to incorporate some exercises where I didn't for years, to be honest. And then the other thing, that this is kind of a bit of an odd thing that I've thought about, but I've also been told by many, many students that they appreciate different class prep materials than just readings of cases, the sort of traditional casebook-like prep materials. And you can use exercises to teach things that we assume people are getting from traditional class prep materials, and then only give them things like news media articles or oral arguments or something very creative and different that they will greatly appreciate, breaking up the sort of monotony of the typical class prep materials. And then they come to class and you use that, let's say, news article about a contemporary issue in animal law and let them work with it in the exercise. And so one other factor I've included is kind of trying to use an exercise as a means of building off of a non-traditional class prep or reading sort of material.
Yeah, it is so true that students have different needs, and it's hard to know all those needs, so you have to kind of guess at how to meet them. But I also spent many, many years just lecturing, and it felt flat after a while. It felt like, we need more energy around this learning process. So I kind of dipped my toe into adding a legislative testimony exercise where it was something I was familiar enough with that I was confident I could convey it to them and give them a good experience with it. But I also was remembering my own first professional experience where right after law school, I took a job that involved lobbying and doing testimony or provide basically a lot of presentation. And I didn't have any background training except law school where we did our legal writing project and our testimony, but I didn't really know how to do a lot of the things I had to do. So I felt like I really want to make sure that whatever students I have, I'm arming them with as much muscle as possible so that they could go out. They might not be as terrified of doing some of the things they would be asked to do on the job. And I think people are universally kind of afraid of verbal presentation. So giving them a chance to look back and say, oh, I survived that and it was actually okay and it was good, making it a positive experience. Those all were things that were on my mind. And then having students tell me, I really didn't think I was going to like doing that. And it turned out it was a really good experience and I've used it since then. That was very affirming for me that it was a good idea.
I think the energy point can't be overstated. I'm now realizing as I hear Nancy speak that I think my decision to first incorporate an exercise was after I was asked by Nancy many moons ago to come in and chat with her students. And I remember that it was either spillover from a prior session, or I was coming into the second half of something purposely designed to be split up. And students were up and about and out of their seats a bit, and they were chatting about their legislative exercises. And I thought, that is a lot nicer than the sort of like, static students just sitting around the table that has always been the case in my classes. The energy thing can really change the dynamic of your classes. Just a little injection of something different. So that's an excellent point. Thanks.
Can I just add two things I thought of when both of you were talking? So going back to what Ralph said a minute ago about, I forget the example you used, Ralph, like oral arguments and maybe some sort of legal filings too. I think, so that made me think that like there may be some sort of gray area, right, between what we think of as like class exercises and not class exercises, in that exactly like you say, if you assign a reading, but it's a newspaper article or like a brief in a case that maybe you've read or maybe you're just going to talk about with the students, I think that alone can sometimes catalyze that energy that you're talking about. I mean, when I was in law school, like I had Westlaw access, but I didn't know you could pull briefs on Westlaw. Like and then I got into practice and I was like, holy cow, there's all these briefs. I can just look at them and see how good lawyers write. Why didn't anybody tell me this, right? Like, and so there's a lot of cases in the animal law case book that the briefs are up there, So even something as simple as like, okay, based on our class discussion or whatever we've been learning, like, what would you have done differently here, if anything, in this brief, right? Are there any arguments you think that could have been fleshed out better, et cetera, et cetera? I think that makes a big difference. And then, Nancy, you were talking about sort of the way that your own work experience had informed, right, your pedagogy in this respect. And I think, first of all, it can't be really overstated the point you're making about how, I think, pretty universal the experience is of us going out into the world after law school, and like everything we got to do, they didn't teach us in law school. So that's really, really important to think about. And secondly, to go back to the prompt, what informs, if you're going to do exercises or not, it's a lot of like my own practice. I practice a little bit of animal on a pro bono capacity, and because I have to learn that and teach myself, those are good opportunities for me. I think I often think about like implementing what Nancy was talking about, which is like, hey, I don't want a student to be in this position in 5 years where they're like, this is their first time doing this thing and they're just having to figure it out as they go. So I appreciate both those responses.
Thank you all. And we have a question in the chat. Could you give an example of an in-class exercise, maybe one that you've used in your classes previously?
I'll sketch out what I do because it's pretty much the same every semester. The only thing that changes is the underlying material, but it's just a legislative testimony exercise where I think of like, what would be a bill that might be introduced, but I never try to use bills that have been because I want it to be fresh. And I don't want anyone to like go use something that's already out there. So my last time it was the Piglet Act of 2024, and it was a bill that would require, it's interestingly kind of appropriate for the moment we're in, but it's a bill that would require more transparency in the interstate commerce of pork, requiring labeling. And so it brings up issues of free speech, and you kind of get a melee of things in there. And then they are assigned an organization that they are testifying on behalf of. And depending on how many students I have, I try to pair them up so they're working together. And they usually build a good association with someone else in the class, which is just more fun and a little better for those that are intimidated. But they will either work for a group that is advocating for the bill or against the bill. And the groups usually there's animal welfare groups that kind of represent a more sort of along the continuum, a much more staunch position on the bill, someone who's a little more willing to compromise. And then your opponents, industry voices, maybe a free speech organization thrown in there. And then they testify. It's just 5 minutes long. I give them all the like very basic bare bones of what 5 minutes of testimony could include, that you're going to introduce, you're going to have a preview of what your points are going to be, then you're going to go through your points, then you're going to review your points, and then you're going to loop back at the very end to how you started, just to give them some basic public speaking skeletal skills. And then they're given about a month to pull together their testimony. They deliver it in class. I ask friends, I ask Ralph and other people, lobbyists, people who work on the Hill in a few cases. One time I got a federal legislator to come in and be the audience for them, and we act like they're in a hearing. And then we usually order in food, and then we sit and relax. They loosen up their ties and their clothing, and then we sit and eat and we do feedback. But the whole point is to make it a really positive experience, but also give them, the clear confidence that they have done that, they've faced that. And then usually, once you do that, it's going to be mimicked in real life experiences. So it's far less scary to have to go do it in those settings. Oh, and we give them the judge bios. We make up key pieces for the bios, and they always have a balanced panel, and you put in little details that if they're really clever, they speak to that legislator directly, try and weave that into their patter.
I love that last piece. I love so much
Of course you
about what I
do.
heard. Yeah, I do. Well, I constantly think about the fact that understanding your audience and being able to speak to different audiences is a really important thing to do, especially in law and policy reform movements, public interest lawyering, that sort of thing. I also love that in Nancy's exercises, it sounds like students get a lot of substantive law, like the preemption and First Amendment stuff and everything, but they get practice stuff, they get perspective. That's all great. I'll tell you that my exercises have never been as elaborate's the wrong word, but they're only for one. The only ones I've ever done have been for one class or one part of a class. So students haven't had as much time to prepare. So very different oriented exercises. They're very much designed to fit into the broader goals of my course, though, which is experiential oriented. It's not the same as practice skills, though. So I'll give an example. One very traditional sort of exercise that I've done is giving the facts setup of a case and having students argue one side of it, more or less. Or actually, what I end up doing is end up giving the students that setup, and then having them in groups come up with the arguments they would make, and then tell them to the class what arguments they've come up with. But I don't have them present argument as though it's a mock trial. That can be really, really intimidating. It could be a very good sort of skills-oriented development, but my class is not a trial practice class. And I worry that some of the things that I want students to get out of the exercise might end up being lost if there's so much focus on argumentation. And so, an important learning objective of my course is understanding the motivations of others, who you're speaking to, that kind of thing. And so we use the arguments the students present, just sort of outlining them, to talk about why and how they should be presented and those types of things. Another example of an exercise that I've done that is tethered again to the broader goals of my course is I'll give students a set of facts out there in the world. They might be made up or they might be based on some kind of issue that's actually happening. An agency wants to kill a bunch of birds around an airport because birds cause somebody to land in the Hudson River or whatever, after hitting a bunch of them. And you have a group that wants to stop that. And I'll ask them to put together a plan for next steps as a lawyer. So you have that group, but you need to think through. It's after we've already gone through things like standing and causes of action and those sorts of things. And so there won't be any right or wrong answers necessarily, but we'll tick off what they've covered and what they haven't. And again, that's because my course is an experiential one, and it's designed to teach students how to develop legal interventions and put together legal campaigns. The exercise is designed for that objective. So those are two examples of exercises I do, but unlike Nancy's, mine are just a part of one class session. I've never done more elaborate things than that.
Yeah, those are great. I really like those. Mine, I think mine have also been limited to a class session, although the one I'm going to share with you now shouldn't have been. It was too elaborate for one class session. So I was saying just before the meeting, I'll put this on the screen just so I can skim through it. Don't worry, I promise I'm not going to read it all. But this was something I did when we were covering the AWA. And the real impetus for this was like the Animal Welfare Act is like hard. It's just difficult, right? Just in terms of like a statutory scheme or a regulatory scheme dealing with the regulations. And I found for me, like a lot of things, it's much easier to, try to work with it a little bit than to try to just read the regulations or even read case law. So the other piece of this motivating thing here was I had a colleague who once told me, like, we were talking about like how to get ideas for scholarship, and he was like, "Oh, just do the things that are really upsetting to you in law practice." Like, he's a former public defender. He's like, there's so many, so many horrible things they did to the clients, and every one of those became articles. So I say that to say that here at UIC, I'm putting this up right now. We have a animal research lab. It's called the Biologic Resource Lab, I think. And I started looking up the USDA APHIS inspection reports, and I found a bunch of violations. Some of them were very bad, and they involved deaths of animals. One female baboon who apparently just became dehydrated because they weren't giving her basic care, and she died. So in order to teach this, you can see it here. I basically just gave them this exercise, and it consists of these materials. You can only access basically the university IACUC animal care policy plans, right? Whatever they are, UIC. You need a UIC login to access them. And then I gave them whatever the relevant AWA regulations are. And then it's like a hypothetical where they are a lawyer or an intern or something at university counsel office. So they represent the university. This one is not about the primates, part one. It's about dogs. And it's essentially just ask them, is the current policy, does it comply with the AWA, the dog exercise policy? Sorry, you can see here, this was on February 13th. So I'm reminding myself of it now. And then it asks them all these questions. This is group work. So I think what I'll do in the prompt next year is I'll update it to say, like, you are like 3 junior, lawyers in the office or whatever. So they go through the questions together. They have to like look at all of these documents, and then it gives them another prompt. The first one is just your boss assigned you to see if this complies. Now you are like higher up lawyer in the office, and an animal protection group comes in and they say, look, your policy does not comply. It falls short of the minimum requirements. So can we work together on this? And like, are you open to redrafting or whatever? And then they threaten you and they say it's going to look horrible from a PR perspective if you don't change anything. So it asks them to make a substantive legal argument as to why the policy complies. And then it asks them for this more sort of like, I don't know what you would call it, like a like sort of public facing PR response, right? Which is like, how would you respond if they did, mount a publicity campaign against you? I've told this story to some of you before, but my favorite response here was I had a student. So I'll read the prompt so I can tell you the student's response. The lawyers respond that setting aside the question of the legality, the policy is underdeveloped and vague and fails to ensure the dog's physical and psychological welfare. They suggest that if the larger UIC community becomes aware of it, it would be a PR disaster for the university. How do you respond? And my student, he's a great student, but he just said, I would just say, okay, and then I would like go back to work. And I was like, I don't know if that's, I don't know. I mean, in one hand, it's like very strong, but I don't know how it would play out in practice. Then there's a second part, and we spent a whole class period on this, right? And the second part is a version of the same thing, but it deals with the non-human primate regulations, and that's where I give them the inspection report, whatever it is, like, the citation, the violation from APHIS regarding the baboon who died. So the advantage to this exercise for me was I had a tie into UIC, and I had a lot of students saying like, oh my God, like I didn't know they test on animals here, right? Which I didn't know either until after I started working here. And that I think helps engage them. But aside from that, I think aside from like the, I don't know what you would call it, like the hypothetical framework, it's a pretty straightforward, go through the laws and the policies and interpret them, I think. So yeah, so this was one of the more elaborate things I did. And what I will also say is like, this was too long. Even though we spent a whole class period on it, I would either make them two separate exercises, just do one, or I would like split the class and have some teams do part one, some teams do part two, and then we come back at the end and they sort of like report on how it went. That's probably what I'll do next time. And also I saw Nancy put in the chat. I echo that. I can share anything. I'll put my email in the chat. I'm happy to email if anyone's interested in materials.
And Conley, before you click out of this, it looks like Rebecca has asked if you're leading them through this exercise prompt by prompt, or having them work in the group, or how you're
Good
tackling.
I kind of just set them loose, and then I do the thing where I just walk around the room and answer questions if they have them, or I'll just like drop in on their conversations and add things if I have anything to add. But like people have been saying, it's great. It's a great skill for them to develop, obviously, like working with team members. Also, they enjoy it. It breaks up the monotony, and like this hasn't always been the case in all the classes, different classes I've taught over the years, but in my animal law class, when we did stuff like this, they were like really great about staying on task, like, because I'm always walking around like, making sure there's no conversations about whatever, and there was zero, so they were really good about it, and that was cool. All right, I'll stop sharing.
Wonderful, thank you all. And Rebecca Kritzer, I noticed you had your hand raised earlier. Did you have another question?
I did, sorry. I guess so first, Conley, that's a great exercise. I think I've probably been erroneously thinking my students share my love of regulatory law and haven't been approaching the AWA in quite as friendly a manner. So I may, in fact, steal that from you. But then for Nancy, I guess I just have to acknowledge I'm a little ignorant on the Piglet Act. And so is this like a real No, so somebody wrote this, and I saw in the chat maybe Becca wrote this.
Yeah, I realized after I said it, maybe Becca actually drafted it. But
I think you drafted it, and I just gave some input. But yeah,
we co-taught that.
it was very timely with all the Prop 12 stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, and unfortunately still is. We're still trying to fend off the Eats Act. So I really purposely avoided using something that was real, mostly to generate some fresh thinking and strategy around the issue.
I'm just, what's the right word? I don't know what the right word is. I'm not overly desirous of making more work for myself. I was thinking about drafting a bill,
Yeah.
a
Well,
little
that's reasonable. It isn't nothing. It takes some time and effort.
for yeah, those of us who don't do it on a regular basis. I was also wondering for the parties that you assign your students, are those real or do you just sort of make up
I
how,
kind of have groups in mind and
yeah,
I come up with silly names for them. And you can if you're in the movement, you can kind of tell who's who,
sure.
maybe.
Inspired
Um,
by.
yeah, I don't disclose who they're inspired by, but and I usually try to add tidbits about the group that would create a constituency relationship to the legislators, um, so that
Yeah,
they can work that into.
Yeah.
It's good. It's a good creative outlet.
for sure. It reminds me of writing final exam practice problems.
It's just like that. Yeah.
Yeah, these are all really great. So thank you guys.
I think one thing real quick on that point of like problem design and hypotheticals and fake names, you can also sort of like combine them. I did a exercise problem. Again, it was way too elaborate. Based on I won't remember. The lab that does like research on farmed animals. Meat is in the title of it, I think. Meat animals.
Yeah.
Agricultural Research Services is the umbrella term, and then meat is the one subset of them.
Yeah,
Mark,
yeah.
I think, actually is one subset of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the New York Times did like a big expose on them. I don't know when that was, 10 years ago, what they were doing with lambs. And so I wrote the whole fact pattern with like like exactly what Nancy did, like some fake name but close. But I included pictures from the article, and just say, it was like some fake newspaper. And then afterwards, because what they'll always ask is like, is this real? Or like, did you make up this fact pattern? Which is, I think, another interesting discussion to have. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea of using, especially if you're giving students prep materials before they actually perform the exercise, using hypothetical stuff. It really depends on so that the students' performance isn't based on who did as much work prepping for it or something like that. Yeah, it's something at least to consider. It may depend though on what your objectives are for the exercise. I like exercises where there aren't set right answers, so that the discussion around what happened in the exercise is also educational, not just the exercise itself. So that we can use the exercise as a foundation for further discussion. And so if I use the same exercise year to year, the discussion afterward will be radically different depending on what students do with it. But that wouldn't work for everybody. I think it depends on sort of what you're trying to get out of an exercise and how you're evaluating it. And so for me, I'm not evaluating, might be skipping ahead a little bit here, but I'm not evaluating exercises as like a separate grade or anything like that. It's really just for the learning value, and I guess it sort of works into evaluation of participation, but that's about it. So, it may depend on what you want to get out of it, but as to how specific and leading you are and how real the situation is and how hypothetical, I like things that are a little bit more nebulous so that students can kind of take them in different directions through the exercise.
Yeah, you're kind of raising the question of how to evaluate these exercises, which I think is hard to answer for me, and I don't know if it's the best way, but it is part of class participation. And I have done 20% on standard class participation, like do they show up? Are they engaged? Are they asking questions throughout the semester? And then I add in another 10% that is basically an all or nothing. Just show up, do the exercise. If you're eloquent and amazing, yay, you get 10%. If you get through your 5 minutes and it's an earnest attempt, yay, you get 10%. You get credit. So it's takes the pressure off them being naturally gifted in that area. Only time I'll reduce points there is if they just don't use their time. Like I've had a couple students just use 3 minutes out of 5. And I just think they really need to push themselves more than that. So I'll dock some points. But basically, I want them to just have a really good experience with it.
Yeah, I do basically the same, and I think the everything Nancy was saying about, for the students is 100% true. I think there's also the considerations on our end, right? Like our resources are often limited. Like I have between my different classes, I'll sometimes have 100 students each semester, so I just can't grade multiple exercises. Like I can't do it in a way that would be fair to the students, and so I'll have like my set graded assessments, and then yeah, it's pretty much, are you making a good faith effort at anything else that we're doing in class? Yeah, so from a practical standpoint, I kind of have to, I feel like.
Absolutely. Thank you all. And thank you, Rebecca, for writing about the exercise that you've done in the chat, talking about how you had students analyze standing declarations and assess them and talk about what they could have done better and which one might be more persuasive. I think that's a really interesting exercise, and I'm looking forward to hearing you discuss it more at the workshop on standing. So thank you for that. So, continuing on kind of the subject of planning and designing these exercises, are there specific subjects or skills within the framework of an animal law course that are more useful for in-class exercises or that are less useful for in-class exercises?
I mean, I'll just say something we talk about, I know that comes up a lot in teaching animal law is like the student population that we get, right? Like, are they coming in as advocates? It's going to vary a lot by school. Like, obviously, schools that have animal law programming, you're going to get a lot more of those students. Or in my case, are they just upper level students who may not know what the course is, but it sounds interesting? So I do sometimes, one skill I do focus on is like, I say that, but then like all of my students were, they were basically like animal advocates from day one. It turned out they just immediately discovered it. So what I did was I did consider like giving them, like you saw in that exercise, arguing like the other side, because I think that is important, and not just the other side, right? But really trying to make it as objective and neutral and like lawyerly an exercise as we can, and not just a discussion about, the sort of moral commitments a lot of us might share, because I don't think that's really the best use of our class time. So I do try to help them look at it from as many perspectives as possible.
Yeah, same. In fact, I try to keep a mental notes on we talk in the first class about why they're taking the class, and you learn a lot about their motivations and their own special interest areas. I ask them to let me know if they have a topic that they'd like to see covered that I can weave in at some point. So using that kind of information, I'm sneaky about making them advocate for a position that is uncomfortable for them. Because I think for all of us, it's so much better if we're ever having to crawl inside the perspective of someone that we don't agree with, and it makes us better at shaping our arguments. So that's an intentional effort. I like Conley that you use like real life examples
I don't
too.
know if I should be using my university's horrible.
There could be downsides to that, but there could
Could
be
be, but
upsides.
I mean, I'll ask for forgiveness, whatever, not permission.
Yeah, that's one of the beauties of being an adjunct. I know you're not, Conley, but sometimes as an adjunct, it can be really hard to get support when you need it. But if you want to get away with something, don't ask first. I'm not advocating that. I'm just suggesting it happens. In response to this question, I don't know that there's any particular subject that I think lends itself very well. I mean, maybe practice-oriented subjects like identifying creative causes of action, not or ordinarily designed to protect animals that could be used or something like that. Like maybe some of the more practical oriented subjects we tend to teach, barriers to vindicating animal interests in the law, like standing and those types of things. But I think any subject could be taught through an exercise, really. In terms of skills, I'm going to regurgitate by stealing something that Nancy said earlier and say that critical thinking and add to that strategic decision making are things that are reasons why I've incorporated exercises where I didn't before in a course that's designed to be about the practice of animal law. Because, but any legal practice involves, critical thinking and strategic decision making. I just feel like students don't get to do a lot of that themselves. And we sound a little preachy sometimes, or at least I do, when we talk about whether someone made a good decision or a bad decision when we're presenting the result of a case, or the drafting of a bill or something like that. And so having students reason through an exercise of how to get something done, how to do it well, how to respond to a prompt, I think can help them further critical thinking and strategic decision-making skills in ways that other types of teaching wouldn't. And so I guess that's my best answer to a skill that in-class exercises are particularly useful for.
Can I quickly give you an example of one I didn't go so well for me? A topic that didn't work well in the exercise context. It's actually the one I was describing earlier, that New York Times thing. The prompt in that was like Cory Booker introduced a bill, and it was something having to do with directly responsive to all the horrible things that happened there. But what they had to do, like we had just done our 1 week on like welfare and rights and philosophy and ethics and all that stuff. And so I wanted them to like just talk about the bill from the perspective of any of these different, right? Like a new welfareist, abolitionist, whatever. And it could have just been like not the best exercise design on my part, but the intent was to get like the more like heady philosophical stuff like out of just reading and do something, I don't know, different with it. But I couldn't tell you why. It just didn't work.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So last question from me before we open it up for Q&A. So you've mentioned how you grade these exercises and how you tend to primarily fold them into class participation evaluations. But apart from formal grades, what feedbacks do students receive on these exercises? Do they get feedback directly from you or in discussion with their classmates? And are there specific things that you give feedback on?
Well, as I mentioned, I have a panel of folks that I bring in from the outside they don't know who are giving them feedback specifically to build their confidence, because almost always the very first thing they hear is, wow, I've watched a lot of people give testimony, and you guys, any of you could have testified before a congressional committee. And they're not just saying that, like it's really true. A lot of people are in the real world are not very good at it and still do it. So it's kind of cool for them to hear that. But it's credibility building that they are hearing it from people who would do this for a living and are sort of beyond the law school reach. And we just spend time giving verbal feedback, and that's about it. We don't really, because it's not a heavy focus exercise for their overall grade, it doesn't seem like something they need written feedback on. But I also offer to go over and hear their testimony in advance and work with them on it. I mean, I really want them to have a good experience. Almost never do they take advantage of that, which is fascinating to me. But their lives are very busy, so I understand it. But anyway.
Yeah, that's that. Yeah, I have the same experience, Nancy, with it's just hard to get students to come to office hours unless it's a graded assignment, right? And or even one-on-one feedback in any context. So I just give them oral feedback because mine are just in class. And yeah, I kind of do it together. I also, in that context, it's different though, right? Because it's like, it's different than grading an exam or a memo or something, or meeting with students one-on-one, because you are aware that like all of their peers are there. So I think it's important to be aware of the balance between like, I want to be honest, and I want to be helpful, but I also want to be aware of like how I need to modify the way that I'm delivering that feedback based on the context.
I know the question mentioned feedback from other students. And I think that can sometimes be tricky if you set up a sort of designated platform for students to critique others, but there's ways to get at that. And my exercises really do involve discussion. I think I mentioned this before. I try to make it so that at the end of the exercise is used to facilitate discussion. And that discussion includes, why did you sort of make the decisions you did? The examples of exercises I gave were sort of taking a fact pattern and developing next steps for litigation, or presenting what arguments you would give, in a particular case on, say, a motion for summary judgment. And I usually do group exercises, so no one's kind of out there on their own, and they have to work together. Picks up on other, important learning, like how to work in teams. Kathy mentioned in the chat early on. And so when we do the discussion, I do find that when the discussion gets going after some feedback from me, other students will chime in with why did you make this decision, or what about this idea? And sometimes you'll see that there's a person in the group who thought differently than another, and respectfully sort of comes up with well, we had thought about this, but we decided to go this way. And so I think sometimes having student involved discussion, not just professor feedback, after an exercise can result in some peer-to-peer feedback that's good. If you have a class culture that's very professional and respectful of other people's opinions, then that can be really good, because in practice, lawyers end up getting a lot of feedback from other lawyers, whether they like it or not. And so, yeah, so that's one thing I do with sort of post-exercise discussion, try to facilitate students talking to each other.
All right, wonderful. Thank you all. So now I'd like to open it up for any other questions from anyone else. You can shout it out or just put it in the chat. Hey, go ahead.
I had some experiences with doing group work, where everybody in the group would grade or somehow go over everybody else's participation. And what it did is it opened it up. If somebody wasn't participated, everybody could kind of mention that this person really didn't contribute and stuff. And I was just wondering about everybody's thoughts on that kind
I've personally never done that. I've shied away from it, which I think might be implicit in the response that I just gave, is a little bit of worry. Maybe it's just me, for students being too judgy about that. But in the real world, that happens. So maybe, it's a decent idea. I will say that I have used techniques that maybe I shouldn't, in terms of grouping students together, to try to avoid situations where one person isn't participating as much as others. Like, I've separated class buddies intentionally. I've put non-talkers together and talkers together so that the talkers have to deal with each other and the non-talkers have to do that. And that could be really obvious, but one time I was teaching with Rebecca Carey, who's in the audience here, and I even came up with colored cards that were going to group people together. I pretended that it was random, but it absolutely was not. Maybe I put too much thought into this. So not me, but I do think that you're onto something in terms of like thinking about different people's natural abilities and skills they need to develop, and sort of making sure that no one exercise participant mutes some other exercise participant, and trying to make sure that happens, whether you do that by evaluation or concocted design like I attempted to. I don't know.
Ken, did you find that people were diplomatic in the way that they shared feedback?
Um, it was an experience where everybody kind of got together at the end, and there were some people who, like there was one person who went on a trip and said, "Hey, I got to go on a trip in 5 days. I'm not going to be able to participate between here and here," but there was stuff due in the meantime and stuff. So there was conversations, like and with everybody, I think before we went into that and did the
Mm-hmm.
gradation, but I think for stuff like that, like for example, like if somebody just comes off as, "Hey, I got something going on more important. Can you guys kind of carry me through this?" It it allows that to be one, it's seen by everybody in the group, and two, kind of reflected back into the
Yeah.
teacher that there was 5 people here and 4 of us did the bulk of this kind of thing. So that's the most experience that I had in it. A lot of people too were just check the boxes, like participated, good job, like didn't necessarily critique as much as a teacher would or something along that lines. I think maybe because they may have felt uncomfortable of it being done to them and they didn't want to do it to somebody else. There was that
Yeah.
kind of feeling to it too. So
Yeah. Well, maybe I've been fortunate, but so far I haven't seen anyone be too hard on anyone in an unfair way when they were offering anything, any kind of feedback to each other. Um, just might have been lucky, but I do know that it's hard on students who are responsible and feel accountable if they are not feeling like someone else is invested as much as they are, and they want that to be seen. And so you're offering them a way to do that. Seems like a good idea.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add, I haven't done this, but I really like the idea. And I think like just telling students straight up a lot of what we're saying and explaining that like being open and transparent and in some cases having uncomfortable conversations when you feel like a colleague isn't pulling their weight is like part of the job and it's a skill in itself. Like for me, that doesn't come naturally, but I got to do it sometimes, right? So I think trying to make it feel like a good practice opportunity for that might make it a little easier for them.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of that. As I said in the chat, I definitely appreciate having the opportunity to give that kind of feedback as a student. So I like those kinds of opportunities. So we have just a minute left. So for our last question, Rebecca has asked if anyone has a favorite exercise that hasn't been brought up yet.
I'm a one-trick pony.
Yeah,
Just the one.
it's okay if, oh, go ahead.
I can share the one that I often start my classes with, and that is to ask students what their most recent interaction with an animal is. And then they think about, oh, I, pet my dog on the way to school or before I left for school. And then I'm like something more recent. And then it takes them a while to maybe think about wildlife, like pigeons or squirrels. And then I say something more recent or current, and then they get confused. And then it's about like maybe what they're wearing or eating or drinking. And then I can talk about things like, the paint or the glue in the rugs in the room that we're in, to just let them know that this is about, if we can't see the presence of the animals, then we can't make conscious decisions about what we think is appropriate. And it's a way to bring us all on the same page, that we all are implicated in this. Like no one can sort of avoid these interactions. So it's not about judgment, but it's about conscious decision making. And that's kind of the point for these conversations.
That's great.
That's a great exercise, Kathy. I have one that I use at the end of my first class every time that your example just reminded me of, that has a lot of the same goals of showing that there are not clear lines, that whether we're legislating new animal protections or presenting to a court or an agency adjudicator, that there are always sort of shades of gray and different values at stake. And it also is meant to facilitate open discussion for the rest of the semester. I ask students, there was an art exhibit, I think in Scandinavia, a number of years ago, where a live goldfish was in a blender, and people had the choice of actually pushing the blender. I don't know all of the details to know whether they had like a tank of extra fish in the back that they would refill or something. And I ask students if they think that after we've gone over like what is an animal in different contexts and what is cruel, and justification and necessity a little bit, I ask students to say whether or not they just raise their hands, whether or not they think that's cruel. And everyone does, of course, but then I talk about boiling a lobster alive or suffocating a fish or whatever. And I don't, I always tell students they can play devil's advocate, they can choose a different side, just to make, a point for discussion. And I don't, then I tick off a bunch of others that I could have asked, but don't ask students the really, tougher calls where the class might get divided, just to sort of, again, get those juices flowing, get people willing to debate each other, but in a respectful way. So that's a favorite exercise of mine because it gets students a little bit uncomfortable, but ultimately more comfortable with the rest of the course.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. We are at time, so thank you all for coming, and thank you especially to our amazing panelists. Our next webinar in this series will be on November 12th from 6 to 7, and it'll be about tips and tricks for efficient and effective grading of writing assignments. We'll circulate more information about that as it gets closer and future webinars in this series. And if anyone is interested in potentially participating in a future webinar, or if anyone has any thoughts or feedback to share, please feel free to contact Dean Hessler. So yeah, thank you all again. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.